Okay, how's it going, y'all? We're going to read some more Lenin today. We're going to read some more of, quote, Left Wing Childishness, written in April 1918 by V.I. Lenin. We read the first two chapters. Now I'm going to read the third chapter. We're going to read the third chapter. I'm going to read it, and you will hear me. But if you can go read it, please do. So, or please go read Lenin. Maybe if you hear this one, you don't have to read it. There would be more Lenin to read. Let's get into this. Number 3. We shall pass on to the misfortunes of our, quote, left, end quote, communists in the sphere of home policy. It is difficult to read the following phrases in the thesis on the present situation without smiling. Quote, the systematic use of the remaining means of production is conceivable only if a most determined policy of socialization is pursued, end quote. Quote, not to capitulate to the bourgeoisie and its petty bourgeois intellectualist servitors, but to rout the bourgeoisie and to put down sabotage completely, end quote. Dear, quote, left communists, end quote, how determined they are, but how little thinking they display. What do they mean by pursuing, quote, a most determined policy of socialization, end quote? One may not be determined on the question of nationalization or confiscation, but the whole point is that even the greatest possible determination in the world is not enough to pass from nationalization and confiscation to socialization. The misfortune of our lefts is that by their naive, childish combination of the words most determined policy of socialization, they reveal their utter failure to understand the crux of the question, the crux of the present situation. The misfortune of our lefts is that they have missed the very essence of the present situation. The transition from confiscation, the carrying out of which requires above all determination in a politician, to socialization, the carrying out of which requires a different quality in the revolutionary. Yesterday, the main task of the moment was as determinedly as possible to nationalize, confiscate, beat down, and crush the bourgeoisie, and put down sabotage. Today, only a blind man could fail to see what we have nationalized, confiscated, beaten down, and put down more than we have had time to count. The difference between socialization and simple confiscation is that confiscation can be carried out by, quote, determination alone, without the ability to calculate and distribute properly, whereas socialization cannot be brought about without this ability. The historical service we have rendered is that yesterday we were determined, and we shall be tomorrow, in confiscating and beating down the bourgeoisie and putting down sabotage. To write about this today in, quote, thesis on the present situation, end quote, is to fix one's eyes on the past and to fail to understand the transition to the future. Quote, to put down sabotage completely, end quote. What a task they have found. Our saboteurs are quite sufficiently put down. What we lack is something quite different. We lack the proper calculation of which saboteurs to set to work and to where to place them. We lack the organization of our own forces that is needed for, say, one Bolshevik leader or controller to be able to supervise 100 saboteurs who are now coming into our service. When that is how matters stand, to flaunt such a phrase as, quote, a most determined policy of socialization, end quote, routing, quote, and, quote, completely putting down, end quote, is just missing the mark. It is typical of the petty bourgeois revolutionary not to notice that routing, putting down, etc., is not enough for socialism. It is sufficient for a small proprietor enraged against a big proprietor. But no proletarian revolutionary will ever fail into such an error. If the words we have quoted provoke a smile, the following discovery made by the, quote, left communists, end quote, will provoke nothing short of Homeric laughter. According to them, under the, quote, Bolshevik deviation to the right, end quote, the Soviet Republic is threatened with, quote, evolution towards state capitalism, end quote. They have really frightened us this time. And with what gusto these left communists repeat this threatening revelation in their theses and articles. It has not occurred to them that state capitalism would be a step forward as compared with the present state of affairs in our Soviet Republic. If in approximately 6 months, time state capitalism became established in our republic, this would be a great success and a sure guarantee that within a year socialism will have gained a permanently firm hold and will have become invincible in our country. I can imagine with what noble indignation a, quote, left communist, end quote, will recoil from these words, and what devastating criticism he will make to the workers against the Bolshevik deviation to the right. What? Transition to state capitalism in the Soviet Socialist Republic would be a step forward? Isn't this the betrayal of socialism? Here we come to the root of the economic mistake of the left communists, and that is why we must deal with this point in greater detail. Firstly, the left communists do not understand what kind of transition it is from capitalism to socialism that gives us the right and the grounds to call our country the Socialist Republic of Soviets. Secondly, they reveal their petty bourgeois mentality precisely by not recognizing the petty bourgeois elements as the principal enemy of socialism in our country. Thirdly, in making a bugbear of, quote, state capitalism, they betray their failure to understand that the Soviet state differs from the bourgeois state economically. Let us examine these 3 points. No one, I think, in studying the question of the economic system of Russia, has denied its transitional character, nor I think has any communist denied that the term Socialist Soviet Republic implies the determination of the Soviet power to achieve the transition to socialism, and not that the new economic system is recognized as a socialist order. But what does the word transition mean? Does it not mean, as applied to an economy, that the present system contains elements, particles, fragments of both capitalism and socialism? Everyone will admit that it does, but not all who admit this take the trouble to consider what elements actually constitute the various socio-economic structures that exist in Russia at the present time. And this is the crux of the question. Let us enumerate these elements. 1. Patriarchal, i.e., to a considerable extent natural peasant farming. 2. Small commodity production. This includes the majority of those peasants who sell their grain. 3. Private capitalism. 4. State capitalism. 5. Socialism. Russia is so vast and so varied that all these different types of socioeconomic structure are intermingled. This is what constitutes the specific features of the situation. The question arises, what elements predominate? Clearly, in a small peasant country, the petty bourgeois element predominates, and it must predominate. But the great majority of those working the land are small commodity producers. The shell of our state capitalism, grain, monopolies, state-controlled entrepreneurs and traders, bourgeois cooperators, is pierced now in one place. Now in order by profiteers, the chief object of profiteering being grain. It is in this field that the main struggle is being waged. Between what elements is the struggle being waged if we are to speak in terms of economic categories such as, quote, state capitalism, end quote, between the fourth and the fifth in the order in which I have just enumerated them? Of course not. It is not state capitalism that is at war with socialism, but the petty bourgeoisie plus private capitalism fighting together against both state capitalism and socialism. The petty bourgeoisie oppose every kind of state interference, accounting, and control, whether it be state capitalist or state socialist. This is an absolutely unquestionable fact of reality, and the root of the economic mistake of the left communists is that they have failed to understand it. The profiteer, the commercial racketeer, the disruptor of monopoly, these are our principal quote, internal enemies, the enemies of the economic measures of Soviet power. 125 years ago, it might have been excusable for the French petty bourgeoisie, the most ardent and sincere revolutionaries, to try to crush the profiteer by executing a few of the chosen and by making thunderous declamations. Today, however, the purely rhetorical attitude to this question assumed by some left socialist revolutionaries can rouse nothing but disgust and revulsion in every politically conscious revolutionary. We know perfectly well that the economic basis of profiteering is both the small proprietors, who are exceptionally widespread in Russia, and private capitalism, of which every petty bourgeois is an agent. We know that the million tentacles of this petty bourgeois hydra now and again encircle various sections of the workers, that instead of state monopoly, profiteering forces its way into every pore of our social and economic organism. Those who fail to see this show by their blindness that they are slaves of petty bourgeois prejudices. This is precisely the case with our left communists, who in words, and of course in their deepest convictions, are merciless enemies of the petty bourgeoisie, while in deeds they help only the petty bourgeoisie, serve only this section of the population, and express only its point of view by fighting, in April of 1918, against, quote, state capitalism, end quote. They are wide of the mark. The petty bourgeois have money put away, the few thousand that they made during the war, by, quote, honest, end quote, and especially by dishonest means. They are the characteristic economic type that serves as the basis of profiteering and private capitalism. Money is a certificate entitling the possessor to receive social wealth, and a vast section of small proprietors, numbering millions, cling to the certificate and conceal it from the state. They do not believe in socialism or communism and mark time until the proletariat storm blows over. Either we subordinate the petty bourgeoisie to our control and accounting. We can do this if we organize the poor, that is the majority of the population or semi-proletarians, around the politically conscious proletarian vanguard. Or they will overthrow our workers' power as surely and as inevitably as the revolution was overthrown by the Napoleons and Kavnigaks, who sprang from this very soul of petty proprietorship. This is how the question stands. Only the left socialist revolutionaries fail to see this plain and evident truth through their mist of empty phrases about, quote, toiling peasants. But who takes these phrase-mongering left socialist revolutionaries seriously? The petty bourgeois who hoards his thousands in an enemy of state capitalism. The petty bourgeois who hoards his thousands is an enemy of state capitalism. He wants to employ his thousands just for himself, against the poor, in opposition to any kind of state control. And the sum total of these thousands, amounting to many thousands of millions, forms the base for profiteering, which undermines our socialist construction. Let us assume that a certain number of workers produce in a few days values equal to 1,000. Let us then assume that 200 of this total vanishes owing to petty profiteering, various kinds of embezzlement, and the evasion by the small proprietors of Soviet decrees and regulations. Every politically conscious worker will say that if better order and organization could be obtained at the price of 300 out of the 1,000, he would willingly give 300 instead of 200. For it will be quite easy under Soviet power to reduce this tribute later on to say 100 or 50, once order and organization are established and once the petty bourgeois disruption of state monopoly is completely overcome. The simple illustration in figures, which I have deliberately simplified to the utmost in order to make it absolutely clear, explains the present correlation of state capitalism and socialism. The workers hold state power and have every legal opportunity of taking the whole 1,000 without giving up a single kopeck, except for socialist purposes. This legal opportunity, which rests upon the actual transition of power to the workers, is an element of socialism. But in many ways, the small proprietary and private capitalist element undermines this legal position, drags in profiteering, hinders the execution of Soviet decrees. State capitalism would be a gigantic step forward even if we paid more than we are paying at present. I took a numerical example deliberately to bring this out more sharply, because it is worthwhile paying for tuition, because it is useful for the workers, because victory over disorder, economic ruin and laxity is the most important thing, because the continuation of the anarchy of small ownership is the greatest, and the most serious danger, and it will certainly be our ruin unless we overcome it. Whereas not only will the payment of a heavier tribute to state capitalism not ruin us, it will lead us to socialism by the surest road. When the working class has learned how to defend the state system against the anarchy of small ownership, when it has learned to organize large-scale production on a national scale along state capitalist lines, it will hold, if I may use the expression, all the trump cards, and the consolidation of socialism will be assured. In the first place, economically, state capitalism is immeasurably superior to our present economic system. In the second place, there is nothing terrible in it for Soviet power, for the Soviet state is a state in which the power of the workers and the poor is assured. The, quote, left communists, end quote, failed to understand these unquestionable truths, which of course a left socialist revolutionary who cannot connect to any ideas on political economy in his head in general will never understand, but which every Marxist must admit. It is not even worthwhile arguing with a left socialist revolutionary. It is enough to point to him as a repulsive example of a windbag. But the left communists must be argued with because it is Marxists who are making a mistake and an analyst in their mistake will help the working class to find the true road. So, socialist revolutionaries were like a petty bourgeois socialist party in Russia. Their name is just the socialist revolutionaries. They had a right faction and a left faction. One of them ended up being who, tried to assassinate Lenin, shot Lenin after one of his speeches. But yeah, they were just like a petty bourgeois form of socialism. Lenin writes about them a lot. He sees them as more opportunists. I wouldn't want to say more, but like he sees them like the Mensheviks. They're basically like the Mensheviks. They're just kind of more. I don't know. They were. I've heard him characterize them as petty bourgeois, more like petty bourgeois socialists. So, petty bourgeois revolutionism. But okay, well, yeah. Well, thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium. All of these are Marxist. Y'all can hit me up there. Y'all have a great day, and